Hello, this is the second video in our trek through the whole Bible survey, biblical literature. The previous video, the first video, was about the story within the Bible. This is not a story that you can just open up to any particular page of the Bible and find it. Ah, there's the story within the Bible. The story within the Bible, this overall arching story, uber story, maybe some call it a meta narrative of the Bible, it's developed over the centuries as Christians have taken a little bit from this passage and a little bit from this book and a little bit from this book and stitched it together into here is the overall story. So you see, they're kind of two stories of the Bible. And the one that we had in our previous video is about the story within the Bible. The story that we've taken the pieces from here and there in Scripture and put together this overarching story: Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Joshua, etc. And that's what the previous video, the first video of this course, was about. There is, however, another story. It's one that we're probably less familiar with. And this is the history of the books of the Bible, because the Bible is not actually one book. In fact, the word biblia is plural: books, little books. And so the Bible is much more of a library, if we read it in context, than an actual one book from God to me. In fact, when I read it in context, it says it was written to ancient Romans and Corinthians and Israelites, hero Israel, and so forth. It tells me, if I read it, and if I take it literally, it tells me it wasn't written to me. And so this is part of what we're going to be talking about: paradigm shifts. As we go through these videos, as we go through this course, we're going to be talking about little paradigm shifts where, wow, and I had no idea. And that's so obvious. Now that I get it, I understand it. But there are a number of paradigm shifts that happen when you go from reading the Bible out of context, one book from God to me, to reading it in context. Dozens of books from God to lots of ancient people, and I'm listening in on their conversation. Now, I don't have a problem with God zapping you, where God makes a verse jump out at you. I don't have a problem with that. I believe God does that. The problem is, of course, is knowing when it's God and when it's the burrito you had for breakfast. Because sometimes people get some weird and wacky ideas when they're reading a verse. Psalm 37, delight yourself in the Lord and he'll give you the desires of your heart. Ah, he's telling me to go buy a Mercedes, or something along those lines. And in fact, a lot of times we grow up with what I might call the memory verse approach to the Bible. Again, I don't have a problem with having memory verses. Memory verses were very helpful to me in middle school. Joshua 1:9, be strong and courageous. The Lord is with you wherever you go. I can make it through middle school because the Lord is with me. When I go to gym class, the Lord is with me, and so forth. And so I have no problem with that. The thing is, of course, is that it had a meaning. And it wasn't, I'm not the name in Joshua 1. Joshua is the name in Joshua 1. What is the context of Joshua 1? Joshua is about to invade Canaan. He's about to invade, to attack Jericho, or at least march around it. And so it is God is telling in that passage Joshua that he's going to be with him wherever he goes. It doesn't apply to everyone. Hitler didn't wake up one morning and say, be strong and courageous, I'm with you wherever you go. Let's invade Czechoslovakia. I mean, it doesn't apply to Hitler. So why does it apply to me and not to Hitler? Well, it applies to Joshua. It was to Joshua. It says it was written to Joshua. It doesn't say it was written to me. There are all kinds of verses where we lift them out of context. And again, I think there's a place for that, but we have to be careful about it. You don't want to use the hunt and peck method as your primary way of reading scripture. Judas went out and hung himself. Go down and do likewise. What they'll do is do it quickly. You can read it for what it really meant. And you do that by reading it in context, which means reading the words that come before and after a verse, and reading also it in his historical context. And the thing is, of course, there is a history we don't necessarily know. In fact, not everybody agrees on the history of when these books were written. Because, as I said, what a book is about and when it was collected or when it was written can be completely different times, can be separated by centuries. And so I was amazed when I was a senior in high school and was studying world history to find, wow, the Babylonians are in history and they're in the Bible. The Persians are in history and they're in the Bible. I was amazed at this intersection between the story world I'd learned in church and the history world I was learning in school. And so when we talk about the history, we'll learn about the time when Israel was a bunch of tribes, or the time where there was kings and they were under monarchies, and then the time when the Babylonian Empire took over, and the time when the Persian Empire took over, and the time when the Greeks took over. And the Maccabean period is in between the Old and New Testament if you're a Protestant. And there's the time of the Roman Empire, which is the time of the New Testament. And so we're going to talk about, as we go throughout the whole Bible, we'll go through some of the theories. There is a tradition that's nice. Tradition is nice. Tradition is tradition. It might be correct some of the time. It might not be correct others of the time. For the last 200 years or so, 200 years or so, there's been the rise of what we call biblical scholarship. And there have been a lot of Bible scholars who've gone through the Bible with a fine-tooth comb. And some of them have had some wacky ideas. Some of their ideas might sound wacky when you first hear them. But then, when you learn more about why they think that, you think, okay, well, that's not as crazy as I thought. We don't need to agree with every theory that we come across. We can't, because they contradict each other. But I do want you, in the course of this Bible, to begin to see some of the theories that have arisen, as well as knowing some of the traditions that have existed. So I want to try now, very briefly, without confusing you too much, to give you a sense of some of the traditions and variations that have been suggested on when the various books of the Bible were written. So I think it all starts one way or another. Everybody agrees that before anything was written down, there were oral traditions, and it's important to realize that we tend to be literary people, because we have grown up since the time of the printing press. Of course, now we're becoming internet people, but ancient people, and up until about the year 1500 AD, the world was an oral world. Even things that were written down were read with what we might call an oral paradigm. They had much better memories than we do, because they didn't have books. They didn't have their cell phone or Google to look things up. And so the more you exercise a muscle, the stronger it is. And so oral cultures tend to remember oral things better than somebody like me from a written culture. And so stories about the flood, stories about Egypt, stories about Abraham, they were oral traditions before they were written down. Now, according to tradition, Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. According to tradition, that was the first part of the Bible written. And maybe that's the case. I'm not going to talk you out of it. If you were to go to Harvard, or if you were to go to Yale, they would suggest that that oral traditions of Moses continued. Of course, there are some who don't think Moses existed, but we would say that if we were to go to Harvard and they believed in Moses, they would say that there were oral traditions about Moses that continued to be passed down before anything was written down. Even during the time of the tribes, that there's still, if you were to go to Princeton, they would say nothing was yet written down that we have now in the Bible during the time of tribal Israel, except for maybe, for example, the Song of Deborah in Judges is sometimes, if you were to go to University of North Carolina, for example, they might say, well, the Song of Deborah might come from the tribal period of Israel. But we have more. If you were to go to a secular institution, they would say it's a time of oral traditions. However, traditionally, people have suggested that Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy well before the tribes of Israel. So then we have the early monarchy. Remember, Israel asks for a king. And now, if you were to go to Harvard, they would say that perhaps pieces of Genesis and Exodus and Numbers were being circulated in epic form around the time of the early monarchy, after David and so forth. And so they might suggest, so one variation is that there was a version of the history of Israel that used Yahweh, the name of God, everywhere, the J source. You might hear that somewhere. And that this epic of Israel that involved parts of Genesis, parts of Exodus, parts of Numbers, had existed during the time of the early monarchy. And also holiness codes. So things about foods that are clean, foods that are unclean, sacrificial practices, and things like that. Maybe some of that holiness codes existed also in the temple at the time of the monarchy. Of course, according to tradition, David wrote most of the Psalms. And I think that's very plausible. Again, there are what we call minimalists. These are people who don't believe that, like, for example, David even existed. But I think it's perfectly reasonable to believe that David wrote some Psalms, and it's perfectly reasonable to believe that Solomon was known for Proverbs. Now, the Psalms themselves say that there were other authors, right? So you have Psalms of Asaph. Doesn't say David wrote them. In fact, Asaph probably lived later than David. And you have wisdom from King Lemuel in the book of Proverbs. And so the Bible itself does not claim that David and Solomon wrote all of the Proverbs and all of the Psalms. And in fact, most scholars, both conservative and liberal alike, would say that the headings on the Psalms probably weren't written as part of the Psalm. So when the Psalms were collected much later on, and of course, the Psalms can't have been collected any earlier than the last Psalm that was written, right? And so that the headings of the Psalms probably date from a later period than when the Psalms themselves were first written. And so even those who would argue for inerrancy would not claim that the headings on the Psalms are inerrant. But so not every psalm that says it's a Psalm of David is necessarily a Psalm of David. That's another tradition that isn't necessarily part of the original Bible. Okay. Now, in the late monarchy, some would argue that this is when Deuteronomy was written. And so, again, you may have heard of a theory called the documentary hypothesis that came up in the late 1800s. Sometimes it's called JEDP, where each letter represents a different source. Again, that was over 100 years ago. Scholarship has moved on. There are more developed theories of those sorts of things. So there are some people who think if I dismantle JEDP in the late 1800s, I'm done with it. Well, remember, there's been 150 years of people making their career on articles on these sorts of things as well. But according to that kind of general theory, that the book of Deuteronomy would largely come from this late, or at least its current form. The current form of the book of Deuteronomy would come from this late time, probably during the reign of Josiah. According to, if you were to go to Harvard or Yale, that's probably what they would tell you. Now, I don't think that there's any problem with us suggesting that the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings were probably edited into something like their current form in the late monarchy. For one thing, the book of Kings goes all the way until Israel goes into captivity, or the southern kingdom goes into captivity in the early 500s BC. So Kings can have been written before the early 500s BC because it covers material up into the early 500s BC. And again, just because Joshua is called Joshua doesn't mean that Joshua wrote it. Not at all. I mean, why would that be the case? You could have a book about Ken. That doesn't mean that Ken wrote it. I mean, you see how these kind of obvious things just are like, oh, I never thought of that. Paradigm shifts. And in fact, although, like, for example, the book of Judges has a very early feel to it, and the book of Samuel has a very early feel. In fact, I would say that the books of Judges and Samuel have an earlier feel than even the book of Joshua has. But all of these four books seem to have been edited as a collection. In fact, sometimes they're called the Deuteronomistic history. And so these books probably reach their final form around the time of the exile in the 500s, the mid 500s, and of course they were probably on the way there before the last part of Kings was done. Okay, historical books. What about the prophets? Well, we can divide the prophets into those who prophesied before the exile, those who prophesied during the exile, and those who prophesied after the exile. But again, paradigm shift. Remember, when a prophet prophesied and when the prophecies were written down and collected and edited may be two completely different things. So, for example, take Amos, who was a prophet. He lived in the southern kingdom, but he went north to the marketplace. He wasn't an official prophet. He was a sycamore tree dresser. And he went up to market in the northern kingdom, and he was just completely disgusted. And the Lord came on him, and he became prophetic. Now, Amos's prophecies, he didn't write them down and read them. That would be a completely anachronistic thing. Amos verbally, orally prophesied. And then later on, his prophecies were written down. We know from, for example, the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah had a scribe named Baruch who helped write down his prophecies. Isaiah mentions disciples that he had who wrote down his prophecies. And so we should not assume that that there wasn't some time, I'm not saying a lot of time, but that when the prophecies were made as individual oracles and when they were collected and written in a book, that there may have been years between that process, and that, for example, the book of Isaiah may not have its prophecies in historical order or chronological order in the first part of the book of Isaiah. But anyway, two prophets to the northern kingdom were Hosea and Amos. And then before the exile, before 586 BC, when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, you had all these other prophets, pre-exilic prophets: Joel, Obadiah, Jonah, Isaiah, Micah, Nahum, Zephaniah. I might say that Jonah is a little different. Jonah is not a prophecy per se. Jonah is a narrative, and so Jonah may not actually, the book of Jonah may not actually come from this period, because it's not a bunch of prophecies like these others are books of prophecy. Then there were some prophets who prophesied during the exile. So in between 586, when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, and 539, when the king of Persia basically said, okay, you can go home now. And he destroyed Babylon, or defeated the Babylonians at least. Some Jews, of course, stayed in Babylon. Some even went on to Persia and lived there, like Esther was in Persia. At least the story of Esther is set in Persia. So who were the exilic prophets? Well, Habakkuk. Well, Habakkuk might be right before, so maybe I should have put Habakkuk up here. Habakkuk is right before the exile. And then, of course, Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, is during the exile. Ezekiel is in Babylon prophesying. Now, according to traditional time, Daniel would come from this period. But there are those, as we'll see in a second, who think that Daniel's much, much later. In fact, if you were to go to Harvard again, they would tell you that Daniel is the last book of the Old Testament to be written, probably from the 100s BC. Now, again, if you were to go to Princeton or to Yale or to University of Chicago, they would tell you that the later chapters of Isaiah, chapters 40 through 66, were probably written at the very end of the exile, and then after the exile, and that they are a kind of appendix, as it were, to the book of Isaiah, kind of the continuation of Isaiah's tradition, but not actually by Isaiah. You'll notice that Isaiah is not even mentioned in Isaiah chapters 40 through 66. The tradition, again, is that Isaiah wrote all of it, and he did it in the 700s BC. Variations. Pre-exilic, post-exilic prophets. These are the prophets after the destruction, after the return from Babylon, after 538, when Cyrus says you all can go home. 539 is when he defeated the Babylonians, if I remember correctly. So Zechariah and Haggai are post-exilic prophets. They're saying, we want a temple. Yes, we do. We want a temple. How about you? And so the temple was destroyed in 586 BC. In 516 BC, the temple is rebuilt. And they're right there on the scene, urging for it to be done. Malachi is the last prophet of the Old Testament, often thought to be written in the 400s. We don't know for sure whether Malachi is a name, because Malachi means my messenger, and the book of Malachi talks about my messenger. I'm sending my messenger before my face. And so it may very well be that the name of the book, Malachi, is simply saying this is the my messenger book, and we don't know who the prophet was. That's the kind of thing that gets people angry. Well, I've always learned that it was Malachi. I was told in Sunday school it was Malachi. I learned in children's church it was Malachi. My preacher thinks it's Malachi. It's got to be Malachi. But again, just because it's possible, I mean, it's a perfectly good argument that there is no name to the prophet, and the name of the book is something in the book. From a purely logical standpoint, that argument makes perfect sense. I'm not saying the name of the prophet wasn't Malachi. I'm simply saying is there's no reason to get upset about it, because it's clear that the evidence itself is not clear, and that our reasons for thinking it's Malachi are traditions that may be true, or maybe they're not. But anyway, the book of Malachi probably dates from the 400s BC. Okay, so other books that were written during that post-exile period. Well, again, if you were to go to the University of Chicago, they would say that it's probably after the exile that Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy reach their current form. Now, again, the tradition is that Moses wrote them all. But again, you find different theories in different places. Of course, everybody agrees that Ezra and Nehemiah were written after the exile because they're set after the exile, right? I mean, Ezra and Nehemiah lived in the 400s BC, so there's no problem with saying that they were written then. Chronicles, again, goes up to the time of Cyrus. So again, there's no problem with suggesting that Chronicles is post exilic, and Chronicles gives us a later perspective on the history of Israel. Esther is in Persia, so obviously it had to have come from the Persian period at least. And of course, there are some who think that this is a novel, a novella. And then again, no need to fight. It's a question of genre. What is the genre of this book? No problem with it being historical. And of course, the Feast of Purim, which is celebrated by Jews today, certainly treats Esther as if it's a historical event. The writings are the last part of the Jewish Bible. This is another kind of paradigm shift. The Christian order of the books in the Old Testament is different from the Jewish order of the books. And in fact, we know for various reasons I'll make clear later on that Jesus himself conceptualized the Old Testament in terms of the law, which is the Pentateuch, the prophets, and the third section of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, is the writings. And so the writings seem to have been the last of this collection to kind of get collected. That doesn't mean they're all from that late period, but the writings itself seems to be fairly late in its collection. In fact, the precise contents of the writings are not agreed by all Jews, probably even at the time of Jesus. But so the poetic books, even if they find many sources in the time of David or the time of Solomon, the poetic books seems to they're in the writings, and they seem to be reaching something like their current form in the post-exilic period. Again, I'm not saying that as an absolute, but just as what is probably the prevailing theory. Then, of course, we have the period between the Testaments. If you're a Protestant, then this is the silence, the period of silence. But of course, as I mentioned, Catholics, Orthodox, Coptics, Ethiopians, and so forth actually think that there were other books written during this period, books like that are in the Old Testament Apocrypha of the Roman Catholics, things like 1st, 2nd Maccabees, Baruch, Judith, Sirach, Book of Wisdom, and so forth. And so now, I will say again, if you go to Princeton or Duke, they'll tell you that Daniel probably was written in the early 100s. Again, the tradition is that Daniel was written in the 500s at the time when Daniel was in Babylon. Then, of course, the Apocrypha I mentioned would have been written primarily during this period for those for whom the Apocrypha is significant. Whew. Well, that is a little bit of trying to correlate when the books of the Old Testament were written in relation to the history of the ancient Near Eastern world. Now, this is like drinking from a fire hose, I'm sure. And so don't feel like you have to have gotten this on the first shot. This video will be around for a long time. And so you can go back and watch it after the course is over even. But I suggest you might want to watch this video again when we finish the Old Testament because it'll give you some perspective. You'll be able to filter what I've said a little bit better and process it a little bit better once we've gone through 2/3 of the course. Okay, what about the New Testament? The New Testament was written over a much shorter period of time, and we have a whole lot more knowledge, I would say, in general, of when the books were written. Although there's disagreement, there's clearly disagreement among people about when the New Testament was written. But certainly the New Testament began with Jesus' ministry, which was somewhere around AD 30 to 33. Now, Jesus didn't write anything down. So none of the books of the New Testament come from Jesus. And we learn about the early church from a book called Acts. But again, Acts was written decades later. We don't have any documents from this early period of the church. From about 30 to 50, the first 20 years of Christianity, we don't have any documents. But that's okay. Don't think of it as, well, it's oral tradition. It could be all wrong. They were very good at oral tradition. And the people who participated in these things were still around when it was written down. So if Peter disagreed with what Paul wrote, then Peter could have said, Paul, that's wrong, because Peter was still around when Paul was writing, and so forth. But the early church is told about in the first chapters of Acts. Paul's writings, 13 letters with Paul's name on them, were written first. They were the first books of the New Testament to be written, and they were written, basically over well, we can debate how many years it was, a 10 to 15 to 20-year period that Paul's writings were written. According to tradition, we would say that James and 1st, 2nd Peter were written during this 60s, probably would be the traditional kind of date. Now, of course, Hebrews is a book that doesn't tell us when it was written. And so I personally date Hebrews to after the destruction of the temple, which happened in AD 70. But there are probably the majority of American scholars, conservative and liberal alike, would probably date Hebrews to the 60s. So there's disagreement. And since Hebrews doesn't say when it was written, there's no right or wrong answer in terms of being kicked out of the church. Now, the Gospels, I would say, were all written after Paul's letters. So Mark, I would date to around the year AD 70, Matthew to the late 70s, Luke and Acts to the 80s, and the Gospel of John to the 90s. Again, not everybody agrees with all of this. There are some who think that Luke is in the 60s and so forth, and so forth. I don't think so. I think it's pretty clear that it's not written that early. But you don't have to agree with me. Everybody pretty much agrees that John was the last of the Gospels to be written. Now, Revelation may or may not have been the last book, but most would agree that Revelation is probably one of the last books, perhaps one of the last books. There is variation, of course. So, for example, again, if you were to go to the University of Chicago, they would probably tell you that 2nd Peter was the last book of the New Testament to be written. There's this concept sometimes called pseudonymity, sometimes called anonymity. It's basically the idea of writing under a dead person's name. And so there are, if you were to go to Yale, they would tell you that Paul didn't write 1st, 2nd Timothy, or Titus. They would say that they were written in Paul's name several decades after Paul's death. Again, that's not the tradition. But these are the kinds of theories. We won't get too much into it because this is a survey course. But I hope that has given you just a little bit of a taste of how different it is to read the books of the Bible in history as opposed to reading it just for the story. Now, you don't have to know all this. Your salvation is not contingent on whether or not you have the right theory of when these things were written. But I wanted you to be exposed in this Bible survey course to some of the different theories, both the traditional and the variations on when the books of the Bible were written in history. So there's the story of the Bible within the Bible that we did in the previous video. This has been just a taste, just a small taste of the Bible issues that are involved of the Bible as written in history. And this has been our second video in our survey of the whole Bible course.